All right, today we're diving into something really important, a different way of thinking about economic policy. It's called a prudent risk management approach to price stability, and it's basically a strategy for a world that's become, well, a lot more unpredictable. Let's get right into it. So let's start with a big question. How do you navigate a storm when you don't have a perfect map? This really gets to the heart of the challenge facing economic policymakers right now. You see, the old maps, the economic models they used to rely on, they just aren't cutting it anymore against these constant waves of shocks we're seeing. Here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll talk about why we're in this new age of uncertainty. Then, we'll explore the solution, which involves a least regrets mindset and something called scenario-based thinking. We'll even see how this works in the real world, and wrap up with what it all means for the future. Okay, first up, we're living in an age of uncertainty, and it's showing us exactly why the old ways of doing things, the old playbooks, are basically failing. You know, for decades, a lot of economies were in this period of relative calm. Economists actually called it the Great Moderation. It was a time of pretty stable growth, predictable inflation, but as we've all felt pretty intensely in recent years, yeah, that era is definitely over. The new reality is just one of constant overlapping shocks. We're talking about things like global pandemics that literally shut down the world, massive supply chain crises, geopolitical conflicts, and of course, inflation that has been both incredibly high and super volatile. And this slide really nails the shift in thinking that's needed. The old way, you'd focus on one single forecast, and your whole goal was to be precisely right. But the new reality forces us to admit something pretty humbling. Any single forecast is almost guaranteed to be wrong. So the goal isn't precision anymore, it's preparation. You know, former Fed Chair Alan Greenspan said it best a long time ago. He said uncertainty isn't just some temporary glitch to solve. It is the defining feature of the landscape. And today's smartest policymakers are building their entire frameworks around that one simple truth. Okay, so if uncertainty is the core problem, what's the solution? Well, it all starts with this really powerful shift in mindset, and it's called the least regrets approach. So what in the world is least regrets policymaking? It's a strategy where you just stop trying to perfectly predict the future. Instead, you focus on choosing the path that does the least amount of damage if, or really when, you turn out to be wrong. It's all about making the choice you're least likely to look back on and regret, no matter what happens. A great way to think about this is like a doctor choosing a treatment for a really serious illness. They have to weigh the risks, right? The risks of acting aggressively, which might have side effects, versus the huge potential costs of just waiting and seeing if things get worse on their own. It's all a balance of risks. Now, this table is super interesting because it lays out the two kinds of mistakes a policymaker can make. A type 1 error is when you act when you maybe didn't need to. It's an oops, but the side effects are usually mild. But a type 2 error, that's the scary one. That's when you fail to act when you really should have. That's how a small problem spirals into a massive crisis that's way harder to fix. So here's the crucial takeaway from all this. Wait and see is not a neutral position. It is an active decision. And in a world filled with all sorts of hidden risks, doing nothing can easily be the most reckless and costly choice you can make. Okay, so if least regrets is the mindset, what's the actual tool you use to make it happen? Well, that brings us to our next section, thinking in scenarios. This is really where the rubber meets the road. We're moving away from that impossible task of trying to predict the one single future, and we're moving toward a much more effective process of preparing for many possible futures. And this isn't just random brainstorming. It's a very structured analysis. You map out case A scenarios where things could get hotter than expected, forcing you to be tighter. Then you have your case B scenarios where things cool off, requiring you to be looser. And maybe most importantly, you explore the case X scenarios. Those are the tail risks, the economic dark corners that you have to avoid at all costs. Now, this all sounds pretty powerful in theory, right? But what does it actually look like in the real world? Let's get practical and see how this is actually put into practice. And for a fantastic real-world example, we can actually look to the Central Bank of Armenia. They didn't just write a paper about these ideas, they've actually baked this entire risk management approach into a systematic 29-day process for every single major policy decision they make. And check out how their cycle works. It kicks off a full 29 days before the big decision just to talk about risks. Then, and this is key, Each board member goes off and independently writes up their own risk assessment. Then all these different views get brought together in a scenarios meeting before they finally get to decision day, armed with this incredibly comprehensive analysis. What a process like this does is it fosters something called adversarial collaboration. I love that term. It means you're intentionally building a system that encourages different, even opposing, viewpoints. It's designed to stress test every assumption and avoid that classic trap of groupthink. And it leads to a much more robust final decision.
So let's bring this all home. What does this all mean for the future of policymaking? And maybe more importantly, why should you actually care about any of this?
Well, the benefits of approaching problems this way are huge. You get more honest communication about just how uncertain things really are. It allows for policy responses that are way more agile and flexible, and by doing all that, you build more transparency and accountability, which ultimately creates institutions that are more resilient and, frankly, more trustworthy. And that is something that directly impacts you. Because at the end of the day, resilient policymaking is what protects the stability of your savings, the security of your job, and the cost of living. In a world this volatile, having institutions that plan for the storm, not just for sunny weather, is absolutely crucial.
As the economist Lawrence Summers put it, a framework like this brings a degree of formality to an idea that good leaders have always understood: the desire to create policies that are robust enough to work pretty well across a whole range of possible futures.
Which leaves us with a final thought, a big question to chew on. As this deep uncertainty becomes the new normal, not just in economics, but in pretty much everything, will all of our important institutions need to develop their own playbook for the unpredictable? Something to think about. Thanks for tuning in.